One of our favorite synergy courses, Pastoral Letters. At least one of my favorite because it's actually speaking directly to equipping the believer for the work of the ministry. And very specifically in pastoral ministry or some kind of ministry role that is in a leadership capacity. And we're going to tackle one of those tough subjects in the Bible in this particular session. This is session number 11, and we're nearing the end of this series. But what a powerful one it's been, and I hope that you're reading through the text. And maybe you've come across some text that women are to keep silent in the church. Well, I like to actually go straight to difficult text and read them directly so that I can get a picture of what the text actually says. And in this particular thing here, the role of church, and I'm now on the top of the page, it says Lesson 8, Pastoral Letters, although this is session number 11 on video, and we're on page 20, at the beginning of page 20. The role of women in the church. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 9 through 14. In like manner also, that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing, but which is proper for women professing godliness, with good works. Let a woman learn in silence with all submission. And actually it says, let a woman learn in silence with all subjection. And I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. He uses the phrase here, modest apparel. Sensible, self-controlled, one who places limitations on their freedom. It is not only the propriety of dress, but the inner life, uttering and expressing itself in the outward conversation. That's an old English word that means lifestyle. And so really, he's saying, don't dress like a street girl, somebody who's for sale. If you're not for sale, don't advertise. And he's giving some instructions here. And it seems as though, and what we understand about our culture, that men are more stimulated sexually by sight than women are. And women are more connected socially, relationally, and look a little deeper than just the skin, although that doesn't mean they don't pay attention to how a guy looks, because you need to especially see some of our new generation and how it's almost seemingly on both sides of the fence. But he's given some directions here about modest apparel. That's the guidelines we actually use in our church language, modest, because people might have different ideals about what modesty is, but it's really, and he gives the instructions, that which is toward godliness, being sure that we're promoting godliness in how you dress. He's not giving really what we used to call a clothes-on message here, where we kind of go through all the clothes you can and can't do or wear, but being modest in the way you dress. Then he goes on to say this potent verse here, let a woman learn in silence and with all submission. And by the way, the name of our church is 2:12, and that's one of those 2:12 verses, 1 Timothy 2:12. Let a woman learn in silence. Do not let her be permitted to teach or to have authority. Now, I want to read 1 Timothy chapter 3, because he talks about modesty there, but he's a little bit more clear about those instructions. Then we're going to come back to a woman speaking in the church. In the 1 Peter 3, verse 1 through 6, wives, likewise be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they without a word may be won by the conduct of their wives, So if you don't have a believing husband, you actually can have influence on them without preaching to them. When they observe your chaste conduct accompanied by fear, do not let your adornment be merely outward, arranging the hair, wearing gold, or putting on a fine apparel. Rather, let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. In former times, the holy women who trusted in God, that's a key phrase, also adorned themselves, being submissive to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters you are, if you do good and are not afraid with any terror. There's some key phrases here. I like the way he says, don't let it only be with the outward adorning. He's not actually saying that you can't wear makeup, you can't fix your hair. I remember Joel Osteen's dad, used to say, he said, even an old barn can use a good coat of paint. And so he's not saying you can't adorn yourself to be beautiful, but he's saying don't let that be the definition or the perimeters of your beauty. Let it be the hidden person of the heart, a meek and a quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God of great price. That actually you can have more influence by your internal person and quality of godliness than you can with your outward look and overbearing words. He said you can win that husband who doesn't have the word without using a word, because the godliness emanating from your being. Now, let's take all of this then into context, because he's telling us here some balance of the involvement of women in the church. And I want to be clear, first of all, just from the passage we just read. When he uses the term for woman, teaching a man, in the original language, you can see that it's talking about wife and husband, that there is role clarification. We've read Ephesians chapter 6 or chapter 5, where it says, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands. And that's been interpreted by the church to be a doormat, and that's not what he said at all. It said, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord. But then in the same passage says, husband, love your wives as Christ loved the church. And he started that whole discourse by submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of the Lord, Ephesians 5:21, before he says in verse 22, wives submit. So he starts teaching where the submission, the wives do it with their husbands do it by loving their wives, and that we have this mutual exchange between the two. Submission is not a doormat. Well, the same thing is true here in the church. And if we also look at the way he's telling us, he's giving role clarification. Maybe some of you have read the book Love and Respect. And the assumption, which I completely agree, because I think Ephesians 5 agrees with it, that generally the greater need for a woman is for love, which feeds her security. That doesn't mean she doesn't want to be respected, but her greatest need is not for respect. Her greater need is for love and security. A man's greater need is for respect. That doesn't mean he doesn't want to be loved. He does. And he doesn't have any security needs. He does. But his greater need is for significance. And therefore, the input for significance is respect. The input for security is love. And so he's giving us really the instructions in Ephesians 5 because he understands the difference between men and women. He's really enumerating it here. Do not let a woman, and when you see this word right here, to have authority over a man. to really usurp authority over him by teaching or by instructing or by correcting. Ladies haven't got this actually, but they correct their husbands in public. One of the things that I've had a challenge with, and I'll tell you, I've worked hard at it over the years because I know a lot of the Bible and I have a lot of Bible students, and people see me as a Bible teacher, and some even see me as a Bible expert, but I'm still a student just like you. I'm still learning just like you. But then I've seen women argue with their husbands in front of me and then look at me and say, what does the Bible say? Like, he's an idiot, but I know you know what it says. And of course, I understand when people feel less than God created them to be, what they're going to do. They're going to hide behind a tree, just like Adam and Eve. And I've now got to provide a covering because love covers a multitude of sin. When you disrespect a man in public, he's now shut off his capacity to receive. And I don't want to shut off the men of my church or men that are my friends from receiving from the Lord. Even if I have a biblical answer right now, might not be the time for me to give it because they've now stopped receiving. And so it's really important for us to catch this principle in role clarification if we think about the difference of needs between men and women. Because there's also then, and you see it in your notes, and I hope you'll go and read these verses. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 12 through 27, he also says that women aren't to speak in church, and if they have any questions, let them ask their husbands at home. This direct text seems to be really going back to the cultural context, because in many of the early churches, they separated the men from the women. They might even have women in the halls, even of the halls of Congress or other places, where the men were on the floor and the women were in the balcony, or separated. Even in some today's cultures, one of our great mentors, Dr. Till and Daisy Osborne, and they actually are ones who helped mentor us, along with Ken and Lynette Hagan at Rhema Bible Training Center, in this whole concept of husband-wife team in ministry. But they said when they went to other nations of the world, women were on one side and men were on the other. But they would always stand side by side to show that God made man and woman to be one. And so that was God's intention. But the role clarification is another thing. It doesn't diminish and make one superior to the other. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, the context of where he says, don't let her ask any questions publicly, let her keep silent, but she can ask at home, is really having to do with the subject of prophecy. He even said that there could be 2 or 3 prophets in the room, but let one prophesy and the other sit by and judge. The keep silent in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, the immediate context is keeping silent concerning the judgment of prophecy. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, it is in the establishment of doctrine, because the word for teach there is doctrine. But he goes on to say, and he's already said 3 chapters before in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. He talks about that the Christ is over the husband and the husband is over the wife, and just as the husband is a reflection of Christ, so is the woman a reflection of her husband. Now, when I first got that concept, it was a little bit scary, because he was saying, okay, I want to reflect. It's really kind of the reflected glory, like the reflected glory of the sun is the moon. The moon reflects the light of the sun. And when we first got married, Stephanie was having a lot of challenges, and I had to own the fact, I couldn't blame her family for all her problems, that I had to be sure that she wasn't reflecting me, that I was loving her like Christ loved the church, that her resistance to following my lead wasn't because I was being a jerk or because I was being a hard-headed man, that I was being like Christ. And there, because that's really, I've summarized that Ephesians 5 this way: wives, submit yourself to your own husbands as unto the Lord. Husbands, love your wife even as Christ loved the church. And I say it this way: wives, treat yourself like he's Christ. Husbands, act like Christ. And that really is the foundation for healthy role clarification and really having a healthy submission and authority relationship, because it's not overruler and under. It's not overruler and servant. Matter of fact, we're going to talk about in church government, but in Christ's way of thinking about leadership is from the bottom up anyway. Who can I serve? So the husband is the key servant in the family for sure. But going back then to the church in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, he's given this illustration that the wife is the reflected glory of her husband. She's going to reflect him. And then he goes on to say, so a woman, when she prophesies, she should do it with her head covered. Now, of course, we've developed whole habits in the church from this, and in some traditions, very strict habits about this, that not only are women to be under authority, but women have to wear a covering. And Paul went on to say, and of course, that's the passage that my dad used to argue with me in the early days of my teenage years as a Christian, that it's a shame for a man to have long hair. Well, in the same context, he said it was a shame for a woman to have short hair. That is her covering. But he's really also saying her head should be covered, not with hair, but her head should be covered. But then Paul went on to say, in that 1 Corinthians chapter 11 passage, he says, but if there are contentions among the church, we have no such custom. In other words, he says, let's don't make it such a strict custom, but the principle is there. Remember, we've talked about the spirit of the law versus the letter of the law. You can take what we're teaching about women and go by the letter of the law. I was sitting at a table of ministers and a group of ministers that I was leading, and for the Coachella Valley. And at the table were a couple of women who were there, and this pastor said, well, we know that it's not the will of God for women to be ordained in ministry. And so he started going on something else. I said, whoa, wait a minute. I said, now in your tradition, in your church, it's not customary to ordain women, but I said, my wife is an ordained minister, but I also need to tell you, these two women right here have finished a Master of Divinity in a university, and they're ordained women in ministry. And I said, so before you take a quick judgment there, maybe that's not true of all traditions. You say, well, then how do we get around these verses right here? Listen to what 1 Corinthians 11 is saying. It says that she should be under a covering. She should have a spiritual covering. In preference, that would be her husband. But what if we have a woman who feels called to the ministry whose husband isn't in the ministry or isn't even in agreement with her being in the ministry? Is she under the covering of her church? Now, being under the covering of ministry is not like a domination thing. Because listen, I'm under covering. I have people who I look to as my mentors and as people who speak into my life. And I'm a man. None of us are exempt from having people who are like overseers in our life and helping give us guidance about where we're going. And so the principle of having the head covered, specifically 1 Corinthians 14, she's not going to be judging the prophets publicly and openly in the meeting. But then she's also not going to be straightening out her husband's doctrine in public. She's just not going to be doing that. But that doesn't mean that she can't be a teacher. Doesn't mean that she can't be a minister or a pastor. but she's going to do it under authority. She's going to be under authority. And we're going to talk about the importance of being under authority here in a moment when we talk about church government, because that is an important principle, not just for women, but for all of us. So in summary, from that particular two passages, 1 Corinthians 14, the woman is to be silent concerning the judgment of prophecy. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, the woman is allowed to prophesy, which, by the way, is public speaking. But it is required to have a covering or to be under spiritual authority. And of course, Paul explains why this is important. We read it a moment ago in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 13 and 14. It says that for Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived. But the woman being deceived fell into transgression. So it appears as though something in the DNA, I don't know, I can't interpret except just to say what it says right here. The woman was deceived. So in that way, correcting doctrine, judging the prophecy publicly, cannot be an emotional thing. That's not to say that no men have emotion and all women are nothing but emotion. But it is to say there's a propensity for some challenges there. So he's just saying, let's just do it in order. Let's just do it with divine order. That way we don't end up in deception. Two great areas that we don't need emotions to interfere: the doctrine and the discipline. Now, let's see what the Bible now says about widows in the church. Because there's no question that often the people turn to the church for widows and to say, well, that's one of the things. And James had said, pure religion is to care for the widows and the orphans and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. In Acts chapter 6, verse 1, one of the first church fights was over how the widows were being attended to. And in some ways, it was a racial caring for, because the Jewish widows were being taken care of, but the Greek widows were being neglected. And they said in the daily administration. So there arose a murmuring, and they were complaining about it. Well, if you then go on to read the text, Peter and John, which in today's society would actually get fired as a local pastor, because Peter said, well, we're not going to leave what we're doing to go take care of the widows. I think that's kind of a job expectation in a lot of smaller churches, especially for the pastors, to be sure that they do the visitation. I had one pastor in Alabama. We had a couple in our church who used to attend the other church, and they were still caring for this close pastor friend of theirs. But he had less than 100 people in his church. But he was out every night of the week visiting families, because that's what the church hired him to do: preach on Sundays and visit during the week, because that was what they thought of. But here's what Peter and John said, and Peter stood up and said, it's not right that we should leave the Word of God in prayer to go wait on tables. But let's find some able men, faithful men, full of the Holy Spirit men to go, that we may appoint over this business. And by the way, in context, the business was waiting on widows. We've taken that passage in Acts 6 and says, well, the deacons are supposed to run the money of the church and the pastor's supposed to run the spirituality of the church. No, actually, in Acts chapter 6, the business that they were supposed to be attending to was waiting on the widows. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 3 through 16, Paul defines and gives some clarification to the church, to young Timothy, about what a widow indeed is, meaning widows that the church should be supporting. And here's what the list includes. They do not have a believing family. They don't have any Christians in their family that know it's their responsibility to help take care of mom or dad. Then, of course, one who continues in prayer night and day. One who is 60 years old or older. And he's going to give a little more clarification about that. Also, a good report among the community. This is someone who has helped the community. They brought up children and lodged strangers, or they've been very hospitable during their lifetime to help other people. They have washed the saints' feet, which really, and relieved the afflicted. Washing the saints' feet is really saying a servant. They've been a servant to others and relieved the afflicted. He exhorts, however, the younger widows to marry. So above 60, but the younger should go marry. And then he goes on to say that he warns of the problems of a woman who are not under authority can bring, because in that 1 Timothy chapter 5, he talks about how they can just be going around as gossips. So really, they shouldn't be a gossip either. They're not creating problems in the church. So there's very few, not to say it never happens, but there's very few widows who meet that. I know in our church, our widows are surrounded by their families, which is beautiful. And that's awesome. And that's the way it ought to be, that we take care of our own. But there is a context that Paul is giving to young Timothy, that let's be sure that we take care of those special people. Then he gives some instruction about respect for authority. And I think this is really a critical key. I have taught parents for many years. The greatest gift you can give to your children is a respect for authority. Because if they never learn a respect for authority, and listen, it's not all your fault if your kids don't respect authority, but it's part of your teaching job to at least instruct them and teach them and hold them accountable to authority. Because if they never get stopped or they get to do whatever they want to do, they will eventually run into an authority. They'll run into the police. They'll be incarcerated. If they have to, they can call the National Guard to stop you. I don't want any of my children or grandchildren to get to that place. I want them to respect authority because it's actually a peaceful life. When you come under authority, it's a peaceful life. You're not always an adversarial relationship, not adversarial relationship with your boss. You're not an adversarial relationship in school. You're not an adversarial relationship in family. And in the church, you're not in an adversarial relationship because you're not always paddling upstream. And so does that mean you can't be a free thinker? Of course you can be a free thinker. But Jesus even gave the teaching that having an understanding authority is the basis of great faith. Because in Matthew chapter 8, he actually talks about the individual. There's a story of a centurion who came to Jesus, and he wanted his servant to be healed. And Jesus said, I will come and heal him. He said, oh, you don't have to go. Just speak the word only. Because I'm a soldier, and I have soldiers under me, and I say to one, do this, and to another, do that. He understood authority, and Jesus recognized his understanding of authority, spoke the word, his servant was made healed. But then listen what Jesus said. I have not found so great faith, no, not in all of Israel. What was this great faith based upon? He understood authority. God is the supreme authority. And that is the basis of my strong faith, understanding he's boss, I'm not. And so he gives some instructions about that, which we'll connect to in our next lesson. So we're really going through here. We're in our next lesson going to continue this talk about authority, but then go into church government because we want to understand how the church functions. God bless you. See you next time.